So there I was, standing on my porch in muddy boots and boxers, holding a 12-gauge like I was filming a country music video. Karen's drone was hovering 6 feet above my cattle trough again. So I said, screw it. Boom. Plastic, propellers, and Karen's HOA dreams went up like a 4th of July firecracker. That's when I saw her, standing on her balcony with her phone out. Yeah, she called the cops. But I'd already called the FAA. And no, this isn't a movie. This is what happens when a Karen-backed fake HOA plays militia in the wrong neighborhood. Freeze frame, yep. That's me. The guy whose private well HOA Karen tapped into to illegally water her garden. What did I do? I flushed her system with sewage. And oh buddy, that was just the beginning. Let me rewind just a bit. I live about 20 minutes outside town. Not quite off-grid, but far enough out that cell signal's patchy and the cows are louder than the cars. My property backs up to this development that sprouted up a few years ago, cookie-cutter homes, perfectly trimmed hedges, and residents with too much time and not enough sense. That's where Karen came from. President of the neighborhood HOA. Self-appointed protector of community standards. She's the type that calls the sheriff because your mailbox paint is too rustic. I bought this land before her subdivision even broke ground. My deed's clean, my property line is surveyed to the inch, and I am absolutely not part of her HOA. You'd think that would be the end of it. But no. Karen decided I was a visual disruption to her aesthetic. First, she tried charm. She came over with banana bread and a flyer about voluntarily joining the HOA for community cohesion. I took the bread, laughed, and tossed the flyer in the burn barrel. She didn't take it well. Within a week, I was getting letters. Official-looking, HOA letterhead, full of legalese that was probably lifted straight off Google. Your barn is non-compliant with local aesthetic standards. Unregistered agricultural equipment on display. Livestock odor nuisance. All nonsense. And all unenforceable. I ignored them. That's when she started flying the drone. At first, I thought it was just some kid with a new toy. But then I noticed the drone lingered. It hovered over the animal pens, dipped low near the windows of my barn, and once even buzzed right over my porch while I was having coffee. It wasn't some innocent flyby. This thing was hunting for something. Or more accurately, someone was watching, hoping to catch me doing something they could spin into a violation. I knew it was Karen. It had her nosy little fingerprints all over it. I put up signs. Private property. No trespassing. No drones. I even shot a warning email to the FAA, because turns out drones have rules. Especially over private land. Especially when it's being used for surveillance. But the drone kept coming. Once, I watched it follow my dog, Bullet, 4 or 5 straight minutes like it was filming a documentary called The Life of a Ranch Mutt. Then came the day I caught her red-handed. Karen was standing on her second-floor balcony, iPad in hand, clearly watching the drone's feed in real time while sipping on what I can only assume was Chardonnay and delusion. That day, the drone got a little too low. It was right above the cattle trough, circling like a mechanical buzzard. I was in my boxers, holding a coffee in one hand and my shotgun in the other. That was it. Boom. Down it went in a whirl of sparks and plastic confetti. I gave the wreckage a little salute before walking back inside. The cops showed up 20 minutes later. 2 cruisers, lights flashing like I'd just shot down Air Force One. Karen was on her lawn in a bathrobe, still holding her iPad, screaming about firearms violations, and property destruction, and hostile aggression against community aircraft. I wish I was making that last part up. One of the deputies, a guy named Rick who I'd known since high school, walked up to me with the world's most tired expression. "Wes," he said, "did you shoot a drone?" "Sure did," I replied. "On my land. Flying over my livestock. After I filed a formal complaint." He scratched his chin and looked over at Karen, who was now filming us with her phone. "Didn't she get warned about that?" "She got more warnings than a tornado," I said. And I've got it all documented." He nodded and sighed. "Well, looks like this one's above my pay grade." And that's when I dropped the FAA bomb. Told him I'd already filed reports, submitted trail cam footage of the drone trespassing, and was told to expect follow-up. Karen's eyes nearly bugged out of her skull. But here's where it gets good. See, Karen wasn't just flying her little toy for fun. She was running it from inside her HOA jurisdiction, but targeting property outside it. That meant she wasn't just annoying. She was violating federal airspace laws. And the FAA? They don't care about banana bread politics. They care about flight zones, trespassing, and unlicensed surveillance. I figured that would be the end of it. She'd get a fine, maybe lose her drone license, and move on to harassing her own neighbors again. But that's not how Karen works. Because later that week, I noticed my water pressure dip. My well, which I personally maintain and treat, suddenly had a strange sulfur smell. I did some digging. Literal digging. And what I found made my blood boil. A pipe. An actual PVC pipe running from my line, underground, straight across the fence into Karen's backyard. She'd tapped into my private well. Illegally. To water her perfect garden full of imported rose bushes and community beautification projects. I don't know how long she'd been doing it. But I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. I waited until 2 a.m., hooked a valve to the line. Opened up the tank I use for cleaning out my livestock pens. You can imagine what's in there. Then I flipped the switch. The next morning, Karen's sprinklers went off like usual. Only this time, they sprayed a brown mist that sent her running outside gagging. Her white tulips? Brown. Her grass? Dead. Her "I love my HOA" sign? Knocked clean over by the pressure. She still didn't know what happened. But she would. Because I was just getting started. See, while Karen was busy screaming at the garden center, I was preparing to expose her entire fake HOA. Turns out there were discrepancies, misused funds, unregistered bylaws, and neighbors who were more than happy to talk. Once they found out Karen was spending their dues spying on a rancher she didn't even have authority over. And that's when the anonymous package showed up at my gate. No return address. Just a flash drive. When I plugged it in and saw what was on the drone's last recorded footage, let's just say things were about to get FAA level serious. I stood there holding the shattered remains of the drone in one hand and my coffee in the other, wondering just how many laws Karen had broken before breakfast. The cops had come and gone, none too thrilled to be dragged out of their patrol routes for what amounted to a grown woman throwing a tantrum because her spying toy met a well-deserved end. Rick, the deputy, promised to file a report just to check the box, but between us, he already knew it was going nowhere. Not for me, anyway. For Karen? That was a different story entirely. The FAA was a slow-moving beast, but once it got wind of someone playing fast and loose with airspace rules, especially when surveillance was involved, it didn't let go. And I just fed it a fat, juicy steak. The best part? I had footage. Karen never knew that while she was flying her fancy little drone over my property, I had trail cams and motion-triggered recordings placed strategically all over the ranch. I wasn't paranoid, just prepared. Coyotes, rustlers, and yes, nosy neighbors had a way of sneaking up when you least expected it. So when the FAA asked if I had evidence, I sent them 3 months' worth of aerial invasions, all time-stamped and tagged with GPS coordinates that proved the drone had entered restricted private land. No guesswork. No room for excuses. Just cold, hard video proof that Karen had been using an unregistered drone to spy on a rancher she didn't even share jurisdiction over. 2 days later, I got a call. Not from the local sheriff or the HOA board or some board code enforcement officer. No. This call came from a federal agent with a voice like he'd been chewing gravel since 1972. He introduced himself as Agent Lasker, asked a few pointed questions about the drone's flight path, and then thanked me for my cooperation. That was it. No fanfare. Just quiet, efficient confirmation that Karen had made the FAA's naughty list. I grinned all the way through that call. Meanwhile, Karen was still in full meltdown mode. She papered my mailbox with increasingly aggressive letters claiming I'd violated community peace ordinances and emergency HOA security policies. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She was running around screaming about drone rights while I was quietly compiling a dossier of her HOA's greatest hits. Every misstep, every fake fine, every out-of-bounds citation. I even started talking to her neighbors, just casual chats over fences or down at the feed store. Turns out, a lot of folks weren't thrilled with Karen's reign. One guy told me she fined him for painting his front door non-regulation blue. Another said she issued a violation for having visibly wrinkled curtains. I mean, what was she going to do next? Cuff the garden gnome? But things really started cooking when the FAA sent me a copy of the official warning they issued her. It was glorious. 3 pages of legal language that boiled down to stop flying your illegal drone over people's property or face federal consequences. I could have framed it. Instead, I did something better. I dropped a copy in Karen's mailbox with a sticky note that said, "Maybe try binoculars next time." Petty? Sure. But after months of her breathing down my neck, it felt like justice wrapped in sarcasm. Of course, Karen didn't take the hint. Instead of backing off, she doubled down. That's how you know someone's lost the plot. They get caught red-handed and decide the best response is escalation. A week after the drone crash, I found a bright pink envelope duct-taped to my fence. Inside was a fake compliance violation, accusing me of storing non-standard agricultural equipment in plain view. She'd taken a picture of my tractor, printed it out, and drawn a red circle around it like it was a murder weapon on a crime board. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. But the joke stopped being funny when I got a call from the county zoning board. Karen had filed a formal complaint accusing me of unauthorized commercial farming within residential proximity. Basically, she was trying to get my ranch reclassified so I'd be in violation of some obscure land use ordinance. It was absurd. My land had been zoned agricultural since before her subdivision had a street lamp. Still, I had to attend a hearing just to clear it up. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about drones or barns or tractors. This was war. So I started digging. Not just literally, like when I found the stolen water line, though that did come in handy, but figuratively. I pulled property records, charter filings, tax documents. Turns out, Karen's HOA wasn't just obnoxious. It was barely legal. The charter hadn't been properly updated in 3 years. The annual dues were being funneled into a private account listed under her husband's name. And worst of all, she'd been levying fines and fees on residents without board approval or legal oversight. Basically, she was running her little suburban kingdom like a tin-pot dictatorship. Now, I could have gone public with it right then and there. But I wanted more. I wanted the final nail in the coffin, something so airtight that not even Karen's Chardonnay-soaked smugness could wiggle out of it. That's when I remembered the package. The anonymous one that showed up at my gate. I hadn't told anyone about it. Not yet. But inside was a flash drive labeled Play Me. I plugged it into my laptop, half expecting a virus or some crazy rant. What I got instead was gold. The footage showed Karen standing in her backyard, headset on, controlling the drone like she was piloting a military op. She was narrating, talking about catching that backwater hick doing something illegal, and how this footage will shut him down for good. Then she paused, looked directly at the drone camera, and said, "They'll never trace it to me. Oh Karen, you beautiful, dumb disaster." The video was timestamped, GPS tagged, and cross-referenced perfectly with one of my FAA complaint filings. It was the smoking gun. I sent it to Agent Lasker. His response was immediate. "Thank you. This changes everything." The next morning, I watched as a plain black SUV with government plates rolled up to Karen's house. 2 agents in suits stepped out. Clipboards. Sunglasses. Professional scowls. They weren't here to ask nicely. Karen must have thought it was a sales pitch, because she opened the door with that fake smile she reserves for HOA meetings and threats. Then they flashed their badges. Her face dropped like a lead weight. I didn't hear the conversation. Didn't need to. I could see the panic in her body language. The frantic hand gestures. The way she kept looking over her shoulder toward my property, like maybe I was the one who summoned the drone police. And I was, in a way. But the real fun hadn't even started. Because what the agents brought with them wasn't just a warning. It was a list of pending charges. And a notice of a federal fine that would shake even Karen's overinflated ego. Karen didn't come outside for 2 full days after the federal agents left her porch. Not to water her roses, not to police lawn heights, not even to hiss at the neighborhood kids riding their scooters too fast down the sidewalk. Her silence would have been peaceful if it didn't reek of calculation. You could practically hear the gears grinding in her Chardonnay-addled brain as she scrambled to claw back control of the crumbling empire she called her HOA. But that kind of silence doesn't last long with people like her. When someone who's spent their whole life micromanaging others starts losing power, they don't take a breath. They throw a grenade. Sure enough, the explosion came on Monday. I found a letter duct-taped to my barn door, because apparently even certified mail was too subtle for Karen now. This one had all the flair of a petty tyrant on the brink. It accused me of willful disregard for community harmony, refusal to comply with neighborhood landscaping standards, and, my personal favorite, intimidation via firearm against community surveillance devices. She'd slapped a fake fine at the bottom, complete with a barcode she must have generated on some HOA template website. I laughed, but the rage behind it simmered. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a full-on campaign. She'd declared war, and she was dragging her entire HOA into it, whether they liked it or not. But what she didn't realize, what she never really understood, was that I was ready for a war she couldn't fight. Because while she was printing out pretend legalese and posturing from her porch, I'd been busy digging through every inch of her operation. I had screenshots, voice memos from angry residents, bank transaction receipts, and the golden ticket, a copy of the original HOA charter that hadn't been updated since her husband's cousin typed it up on a Windows XP laptop in 2008. And buried in that outdated, poorly scanned document was the clause that changed everything. It stated, in no uncertain terms, that the HOA's authority extended only to properties voluntarily signed into its jurisdiction with a countersigned agreement. No such agreement existed for my land. I'd never signed anything, never agreed to anything, and had the original purchase documents that proved my property wasn't under any HOA umbrella. Meaning every fine, letter, or order she'd ever issued to me was as legally binding as a napkin doodle. And more importantly, it meant any resources spent targeting me, drones, letters, legal filings, had been funded through improper use of HOA dues. Misappropriation of community funds. A violation so severe that in some states, it could result in criminal charges. I started making calls, quiet ones, to state regulators, HOA oversight boards, the local attorney who handled property dispute. I wasn't loud about it. No need to gloat. I wanted her to feel safe, right before the ground collapsed under her stilettos. One of the regulators I spoke to, nice guy, name was Jim, nearly choked when I read him the clause from her own charter. He asked for copies of all correspondence. I sent him a file so thick it probably broke his scanner. He promised a formal inquiry within the week. Meanwhile, the neighborhood started stirring. I could tell Karen had tried to rally her troop. Yard signs went up overnight. Protect our standards in ugly font. Someone even left a little HOA flyer on my gate saying there'd be a community gathering to reaffirm values. I didn't show up, obviously. But I had a friend who lived 3 doors down from Karen who did. And what he told me was better than any courtroom drama. Karen stood at the front of the clubhouse, clipboard in hand, voice trembling as she launched into a tirade about rural threats, non-compliant elements, and the dangers of allowing renegade behavior on the edge of civilization. She tried to paint me as some unhinged, gun-waving lunatic who was threatening their peaceful way of life. But then someone asked why HOA funds had been used to purchase drone equipment that was never approved in any budget. And someone else asked about the garden renovation she commissioned using contractor funds, contractors who turned out to be her brother and his landscaping company, which didn't even exist 3 years ago. The room, apparently, turned on a dime. Suddenly it wasn't about my tractor or my barn or my shotgun. It was about the missing money, the shady bookkeeping, the way every vote for neighborhood improvements seemed to happen in Karen's kitchen with no record. By the end of the meeting, half the room was demanding access to the HOA's financials, and Karen had to fake a migraine just to escape. A neighbor recorded the whole thing, sent it to me with a laughing emoji. The cracks were spreading, and Karen could feel it. That's when the Facebook posts started. She began flooding the local community group with vague, passive-aggressive posts about certain individuals spreading lies and outside threats to suburban integrity. She posted blurry pictures of my cows and claimed they were endangering local wildlife. She even accused me of poisoning her roses with chemical runoff, which made no sense since the only thing I sprayed near the property line was her stolen water tap, and that had been manure, not chemicals. But my favorite post came the night after the HOA board finally got a whiff of the real storm coming. Karen posted a screenshot of an email from the FAA, which clearly stated her drone license was under suspension pending investigation. She tried to spin it like she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign, claimed she'd been targeted for documenting violations of community peace. But all anyone saw in the comments were laughing reactions and people tagging each other like, "Isn't this the lady who made you repaint your fence 3 times?" Or, "She tried to fine me for wind chimes." I stayed quiet, let the storm swirl around her while I sat back on my porch with a beer, watching it all unravel like a bad reality show. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because remember that water tap she installed illegally? I'd filed a separate report for that. And unlike the drone, which took federal agencies a while to move on, the county health inspector had no patience for unauthorized plumbing lines crossing property boundaries, especially when the source line hadn't been permitted. The inspection happened quietly. They came out early one morning, snapped a few pictures, took a sample, and left. 2 days later, Karen got slapped with a cease and desist order and a health code violation that came with a fine large enough to make her rethink those luxury tulip bulbs she loved so much. Her precious garden? Dead within a week. The well? Shut off until further notice. She had to start paying for water again like the rest of her neighborhood, and you better believe she tried to pass that bill on to her HOA members. It didn't work. By that point, they were sharpening pitchforks. But the moment I knew the tides had truly turned was when a neighbor I'd never even spoken to knocked on my gate with a casserole and said, "We never liked her either. Thanks for finally doing something about it." The best part? The hearing with the state HOA regulatory board was scheduled for the end of the month. Karen had no idea what was waiting for her there. But she was about to find out. The morning of the hearing, I took my time. Fed the cows, sipped my coffee, checked the trail cams for any new surprises. There were none. Even the air felt different, like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final nail to slide into the coffin of Karen's fake little kingdom. I wasn't nervous. I'd done my homework, double-checked the documents, printed out every single piece of evidence 3 times over. But I'll admit, as I stood there in my cleanest flannel shirt, watching the sun rise over my pasture, I couldn't help but smile at how far things had come. Karen had started this fight with a drone and a clipboard. I was going to end it with facts, patience, and a very well-organized binder. I didn't attend the hearing alone. A few of her neighbors came too. Turns out, when people see the Queen's crown slipping, they're more than happy to help knock it off. The meeting was held at the county office, in a room that looked like it had been built in 1974 and forgotten ever since. The panel was 3 people, state-appointed regulators who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, until Karen started talking. She came in swinging. Hair done, face powdered, posture military straight. She strutted in with a stack of files and a smug look, as if she was about to teach everyone a lesson in suburban governance. She had no idea she was walking into her own funeral. Karen started off by claiming she had been harassed, intimidated, and unfairly targeted by a radical anti-community element. That would be me, of course. She called me combative, non-compliant, and at one point I swear she said emotionally unstable livestock enthusiast. She had no clue what was in the binder I placed gently on the table. But the moment I opened it and passed out copies to each board member, her face lost a little of that pink gloss. The documents inside were everything. The outdated HOA charter, the misuse of funds, drone surveillance footage with matching FAA timestamp, screenshots of social media posts where she bragged about spying, receipts for unapproved expenses billed to the HOA budget, and the cherry on top, a sworn affidavit from one of her own board members confirming she'd been making executive decisions without consent or vote. The board let her talk for almost 30 minutes, nodding politely, before they even looked at me. I didn't say much, just laid out the facts, 1 page at a time. Calm, methodical, surgical. The more I spoke, the quieter Karen got. By the time I got to the illegal water tap and the county health code violation she'd already been fined for, she was shifting in her seat like she couldn't find a comfortable lie to sit on. The board asked her a few questions. Simple ones, really. Where was the updated charter? Why hadn't dues increases been filed? Who authorized the drone? Her answers were vague, defensive, and at one point, she claimed her husband was responsible for all financial transactions. That didn't sit well. By the end of it, the board told her they'd be issuing a formal decision within the week. Karen tried to object, said she had more documentation at home, begged them to delay. They told her the evidence presented was sufficient for review. She left in a flurry of fake calm and unspoken threats, muttering something about calling her lawyer. But you could tell. She knew. She wasn't walking out of that building with her crown intact. The fallout didn't take long. Within 3 days, a letter was delivered to every home in the HOA. Official state findings. Misuse of funds. Charter violations. Unauthorized surveillance. Abuse of authority. Her license to operate as HOA president was revoked. The HOA itself was ordered to hold an emergency election and submit to external audit for the next fiscal year. But the part that really made my week? Karen was barred from holding any leadership position in any registered HOA in the state for the next 5 years. Her neighbors wasted no time. They didn't just vote her out, they buried her reputation under the weight of every petty rule she'd ever enforced. The guy with the non-regulation blue door repainted it lime green just for the spite of it. Someone put up a 10-foot inflatable flamingo on their lawn with a sign that said, "In memory of Queen Karen." Another neighbor hosted a Freedom from Fines barbecue. I didn't attend, but I did send over a cooler of ribs with a sticky note that said, "Compliments of the emotionally unstable livestock enthusiast." Karen tried to save face. For about a week she walked around the neighborhood like she still had power, smiling too wide, nodding at people who no longer made eye contact. But the cracks showed. Her roses wilted. Her fence paint started peeling. Her lawn got a little less perfect. She stopped complaining about my cows. Stopped sending letters. Stopped speaking at all, really. One day, a for sale sign appeared in her yard. No announcement. No open house. Just a quiet surrender. That weekend, I hosted my own little gathering. I put out some tables by the fence line, fired up the grill, cracked open a cooler, and let the smell of smoked brisket do the advertising. Neighbors wandered over, curious at first, then grateful. Turns out, when you're not issuing fines and threatening citations, people actually enjoy themselves. We talked, laughed, shared stories, most of them involving Karen. The guy from 3 doors down told me she once tried to issue a citation because his wind chimes were unpatriotic. Another said she took pictures of his backyard and sent them to his HOA email with digital arrows pointing to offensive clutter. The offensive clutter was a sandbox. As the sun dipped below the tree line, someone asked me how it all started. I looked over at the fire pit, thought about the drone, the pipe, the sewage, the FAA, the hearing, the ribs. I smiled. It started with a drone, I said. And ended with a casserole. We all laughed. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking about that final piece of mail I'd received from the FAA just 2 days prior. It was a notice confirming Karen's drone license was officially revoked. Not suspended. Not under review. Revoked. She was banned from operating drones in a 5-state region due to intentional misuse of aerial surveillance devices and repeated violations of private airspace. The last time I saw Karen, she was standing on her porch, staring out at my pasture. Her garden was gone. Her fence sagged. Her drone dreams were shattered. And for once, she didn't say a word. No lecture, no passive-aggressive note, no clipboard in hand. Just silence. I raised my coffee cup in her direction. She didn't wave back. I don't know where she went after she sold the house. Frankly, I don't care. The HOA elected a new board, reasonable folks, the kind who understand that rules are supposed to serve people, not crush them. The flamingo stayed. The wind chimes played. And my cows, bless their hearts, kept mooing just as loud as ever. I never flew a drone in my life. Never needed to. When you live right, stand your ground, and don't take crap from people pretending to have power they don't, justice has a funny way of coming around. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's loud. And sometimes it sounds a whole lot like a shotgun blast over a cattle trough. And I'd do it all again. Every letter, every step, every sarcastic sticky note. Because people like Karen think they're untouchable. That they can fly above the rules and spy on anyone they want without consequence. But the sky, just like the law, has limits. And I was happy to remind her exactly where they are.